The quartet kept playing. A string of violins rose and fell in the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Notes threaded through crystal chandeliers and white roses. They crossed tuxedos and silk and the small, bright hum of conversation that held itself polite and shallow. At the far side of the entrance, an older man moved like someone used to being unnoticed. He wore a navy suit that was not new, a shirt pressed with care, a tie chosen for the wedding but not for spectacle. Two security officers guided him with soft, professional hands, more redirection than arrest toward the coat room. He paused at the doorway. For a second, his hand slipped into the inner pocket of his jacket. There was a small white envelope between his fingers, folded like a private decision. He held it there, then let it fall back into his pocket as if the act of reaching had been a kind of private benediction. The doors closed behind him. 3 weeks later, that slow, courteous removal would ripple into the kind of institutional motion no single person could have predicted. The moment that felt like an etiquette break in the man being led to the edge of the room would be the hinge for procedures, memos, and meetings in a bank's windowless conference room. But in the ballroom, the quartet played on. If you like quiet, true stories like this, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. After the doors closed, the guests did what they always do at weddings. They rearranged themselves into the safest story. Some rearranged seats. Others rearranged the meaning of what they'd seen. Vivian Whitfield, flawless in champagne silk, continued a conversation about table favors as though steering a ship through an unremarkable harbor. The groom straightened his jacket and smiled at the wrong time. The bride's face, Celeste Forum, settled into a surface calm. Under it, however, everything was beginner-level electric. Celeste had learned to read rooms the way some people learn to read weather. She was a child in a house that kept the windows trimmed of scandal and the curtains drawn on spectacle. Wendell Forum, her father, had taught her how to notice without being noticed and how to keep the record. "Write it down," he'd say, and his voice was the kind that did not want to be dramatic. He meant a pen, a line, a fact. When Celeste was a teenager, that sentence saved her from gossip and from decisions made on hot breath. She kept notebooks from adolescence to this wedding day, small hard-covered journals, with the corners softened by pocket friction. She collected details like someone collecting stamps. The temperature of a room, the scent that lingered in the lobby, whether a host remembered a waitress's name. Her notebooks were practical, nothing or nothing. She used them the way an analyst uses raw numbers, to make sense later. By trade she had become a compliance analyst at a regional financial services firm. Compliance had a grammar all its own. Timestamps, document names, It trained Celeste to follow process, to look for the hinge points where decisions turned into consequences. In office light she made lists and found patterns. In quiet rooms she watched gestures for what they revealed when words did not. She met Brennan Whitfield at a gallery opening months before their engagement party. He had a laugh there that was a little too loud for the space and a pocket square that coordinated with his watch. He liked lines, both architectural and social, and he cared about who could see him care. Where Celeste recorded, Brennan performed. They learned to move in each other's orbit. He grew fond of the way Celeste could stop him from She grew fond of how he could make a room tilt toward possibility. It was not a match made against the world so much as a match negotiated with it. Vivian, Brennan's mother, was always at the edge of these negotiations. She had the posture of someone who had been taught where people belonged and what they deserved. Her social sense was sharp. Her discontent with Wendell's seat at the rehearsal table had been small. An arrangement moved slightly north of him, a napkin folded at his place that suggested an afterthought. Nothing dramatic. Enough, though, to make a few people notice. Rehearsal dinner notes, Celeste wrote in the notebook months later. 10/13, 7:45 p.m. Rehearsal table moved. Wendell seated it back. Vivian prize. Tanisha watches, she wrote, like a person making breadcrumbs for the future. Tanisha bridesmaid, longtime friend, able to anchor Celeste's laughter in noisy rooms, sat across the table and said nothing outright, but her eyes tracked Vivian's fingers. Percy, one of Brennan's associates, who liked the sound of his own competence, joked about timing. The jokes landed in the thin air between people who knew the rules and those who were already transgressing them. On the morning of the wedding, Celeste was in the bridal suite with the small things that felt like anchors. A ribbon, borrowed from her mother. A photograph of Wendell, on the kitchen wall, she had asked him to sign when she left for college. She checked her list twice, and then again. She was aware of the hum of the hotel's the faint sound of the florist rearranging peonies in the next room, the low pop of champagne corks opening like miniature confessions. The veil lay on the chaise. A seamstress pinched one tiny thread. She had time to be nervous and time to be observant. Wendell had come early. He liked to arrive before crowd noise filled a room. He still believed in the shape of sincere things. He carried the white envelope in his jacket pocket. He had written a letter for his daughter, simple sentences, an old man's careful handwriting, no legalese, no demands. The content of the envelope was personal, a father's instructions on how to be loved rather than on how to run a company. He had folded it 3 times, as he had been taught. He intended to hand it to Celeste before she walked down the aisle. What happened at the doorway was small and surgical. Guests had started arriving. The hotel had a protocol about entrances and crowd lines. Brennan, who had seen Wendell's jacket and the unfashionable tie, made a note of the attention the way a public figure measures posture. He felt, at the moment, a prick of embarrassment. Vivian felt it sharper and immediately shaped the perimeter. Someone, a wedding planner or a maitre d', conferred with a security manager, and the officers were simply doing their jobs, guiding an elderly guest to a quieter place. The officers were not cruel. They were mercifully efficient. Celeste watched as her father paused at the doorway and reached into his inner pocket. She registered the motion like a ricochet in a pond. A small white rectangle in envelope was withdrawn by his fingers and then tucked back in again. He let it rest there against his chest. There was no flourish. There was no speech. The doors closed. She writes the moment down later in her notebook with the clean economy that had become her habit. 10:14, 10:52 a.m., table 11. Wendell escorted. Envelope returned to pocket. Quartet continues. Her hand had a small tremor, the sort that comes when something private has been denied its private transmission and made public instead. People made the practical gestures after that. Friends assured the couple it had been nothing. Tanisha sat with Celeste and tried to manage the conversation with quiet jokes about the weather and the band. Percy whispered that someone had been overcautious, and someone else remarked that older fathers could be difficult. The phrasing made it sound like a middle school social error rather than the careful judiciary of adult exclusions. Celeste felt the story shift under her feet. Later that morning, after vows spoken with the strain that comes from performing joy, Celeste found a chair at the back of the reception room and opened her notebook. She wrote the time and the place, and then, beneath it, the small, stubborn detail that would not leave her, the envelope. She knew something about how paperwork could obscure or reveal truth. In compliance, people hid intentions in process as much as in statements. So she did what she always did when she wanted to understand. She wrote it down, and then she resolved to follow the trail. Celeste did not believe in conspiracies, but she did believe in structures. Structures made possible what one person could not. They also protected what one person could do at a distance. She started by scanning what she already knew. Wendell had been involved in family affairs for years. He had never been a public figure. He preferred the library to the boardroom, yet names in her father's emails had always included the phrase Forum Trust. She had seen the trust's name in passing on charity solicitations and once on a plaque at the community center. It was an ownership presence that people did not discuss the way they discussed a bank's signage on a skyscraper. At home that night, after the last guest had drifted out and the hotel room quieted to the shape of someone trying to sleep, Celeste opened her laptop. The screen threw a rectangle of light that she angled away from Brennan, who slept like someone who had not yet been taught to count the rules in a room. She brewed coffee and cracked the notebook open. Her pen hovered. Her research began in the small, predictable places state filings. Corporate registry, a PDF of a quarterly report that referenced major shareholders. She moved from broad to specific and then to the meticulous. The phrase Forum Family Trust showed up as an entity with a board and an advisory chair. That was Wendell's title. Advisory chair implied influence, not necessarily executive decision-making advice more than command. But a footnote on a governance schedule made the link clearer. The trust controlled voting percentages far above any other individual. Controlling trust? In plain terms, majority vote. The family entity could direct the bank's strategic choices through its voting weight. Celeste did not jump to conclusions. She knew enough to keep process alive. She opened the filings for Keystone National Bank, whose name looked, on paper, like the stable instrument of regional finance, small branches with serious bricks, a list of community grants, a picture of steady. She scrolled past mission statements and found the lender relationships. Whitfield and Crane Development Group. Brennan's company was listed as a borrower on a large financing package, a lead credit facility for a $265 million mixed-use project on the riverfront. The lead credit facility, she wrote in the margin, is the primary loan that enables a big development, one that sets the timeline and the key oversight conditions. If the lead lender exercises caution, the chain of subcontractors pauses, permits strain, and construction slows. She made another note: Keystone equals lead lender on $265 million. Forum Family Trust equals controlling interest in Keystone. Effect: governance measures could impact credit terms. She underlined governance in a neat stroke. The puzzle pieces were shaped like ordinary things: a trust, a bank, a loan. Separately, they had biographies that fit. Together, they had force. Celeste printed documents, highlighted lines, took photos of PDFs with her phone to read on the subway when she later remembered them in the small dislocations of everyday life. Her hands did not tremble. They moved with the quiet method of someone cataloging a fact that had consequences. She started creating a timeline. 10:13 rehearsal dinner, table moved. 10:14, 10:52 a.m. wedding. Father escort, envelope in pocket. 10:14 afternoon. Guests leave. 10:14 night. Celeste researches and finds forum trusts, controlling interests. The rhythm of the timeline made the seed of the connection obvious. The person pushed from the room was not merely an awkward older guest. He was, in legal terms, an institutional shareholder with governance influence. The envelope's presence now seemed like a small, human counterpoint to corporate weight. Celeste called Tanisha the next day to read a single line off Afila Convert's shame and how excited she felt about the precision of a board registry. "Listen," she said. "The trust lists an advisory chair. It's Dad." Tanisha, who kept her emotions at the surface that made them easier to manage, said only, "So what? He's old." "He's not?" And then she stopped. Even Tanisha's habitual bluntness knew the space where institutional reality suggested complexity. Celeste did not call Brennan that morning. She wanted facts first. She kept thinking of the envelope folded in Wendell's pocket, what it contained, how it had been withheld in. She thought of the mechanics of lending. If a lender at the level of Keystone pulsed its risk flag, it would do so via review and metrics. It would not smear a couple across headlines. It would open a file, place requests for more documentation, ask the borrower to produce additional collateral assessments, or to restructure covenants. Those technical words were dull in conversation, but they carried the weight of real consequence. Delays, cost increases, confidence dipping in the eyes of contractors and investors. Her pen wrote the likely path in small, unromantic lines. She did call one person, but not a member of the forum circle. She called Portia Wells, a senior credit analyst at Keystone, whose name she had found on a public disclosure listing key committee members. Portia answered with a string of practical syllables that made Celeste think of a well-oiled machine. Celeste did not say everything. She did not accuse. She asked about process in the abstract, the way a lawyer asks about standing. If a bank's lead lender begins a governance review, what typically follows? Portia explained without drama. Committees convene. A request for additional documentation often accompanies any material adverse change note, and a recommendation for restructuring is made if risk indicators are deemed to have shifted. "It's not personal," Portia said. "It's procedure." That line lodged. Not personal, procedure. Celeste's next hours moved like a documentary sequence. Files opened, notes taken, timelines assembled. She found the meeting minutes for Keystone's credit committee from late summer. In the margins of an appendix, she found a reference to risk concurrency in the Whitfield and Crane deal, sensitivity tests, rates of return tied to pre-leasing performance. There were no sudden alarm bells. There was, though, a footnote referencing major shareholder review as a contingency. She underlined contingency and felt the place in her chest that corresponds to the knowledge that systems, when they move, do so slowly and then with an efficacy that can feel sudden to those in their path. That same evening she pulled out the envelope again, not to read what was not hers, but to feel the shape of the action she had not allowed to complete. Wendell had put the letter into the pocket like a final act of private governance. He had intended a personal handoff. A father's words to a daughter about how to be loved and respected. The public prevention of that simple exchange now bore a new gravity. The small domestic humiliation of being moved to the back of a dinner table touched a system capable of pausing construction cranes. Celeste tucked the notebook under her arm and walked down to the hotel lobby. She wanted to see the route her father had taken. The lobby was quiet then, all low lamps and the smell of coffee brewed late. She moved with a purpose that was both conciliatory and investigative. She found the coat room attendants still folding jackets, polite eyes, taking the measure of someone who belonged there and someone who did not. He remembered Wendell. He said the man had seemed steady, had taken a breath, and had let them suggest a seat. Nothing dramatic, the attendant said. Just needed a seat out of the way for the ceremony. Celeste did not ask the attendant to betray discretion. She only stored the phrasing. Nothing dramatic. He had held his envelope close enough to feel the weight of it against his chest. In her apartment that night she rubbed her temples and tried to imagine what it would mean to take this information somewhere useful. What authority did she have as the bride to make a claim? What if she told Brennan and he pushed for a furious, theatrical reaction against the people who had escorted his father? What if he told Vivian and she turned it into a social contest? Celeste remembered her father's voice, urging patience. Write it down, he had said for years. Then act from fact. She closed her notebook and listed, in tidy bullet form, what needed to be verified. The forum trusts, governance documents, Keystone Committee schedules, the exact language in the Whitfield loan covenants that permitted a review in the event of ownership changes. She stayed up into the night, cradling coffee like a small companion. Because an analyst's job insists on light during hours when others sleep. She compared copies of the trust's declaration with the bank's shareholder registry and mapped percentages with the flatness of a spreadsheet. When the numbers lined up, there was a clean, terrible clarity. The trust had the votes necessary to influence strategy at Keystone. If the trust chose to draw attention, it could trigger internal reviews. It would be done through memos and the dry language of committees. Additional documentation requested, recommendation to restructure facility, temporary holds on disbursements, pending updated covenants. None of those terms were theatrical. They were, instead, the instruments of a system that operated on risk and certainty, not on spectacle. She imagined the domino. A bank asks for more documentation. A developer waits. Contractors wait. Investors watch the horizon shift from certain to tentative. The music of the quartet at the wedding was not the soundtrack of this motion. The bank's compliance checks were. She could see the technical path as clearly as she had seen the path out of the ballroom. Celeste made notes with the specific rhythms of someone building a case but not yet intending to prosecute anyone. Her lines were meant to create a map she could navigate with dignity, not to weaponize private mortification. She wrote, Wendell Advisory Chair, Forum Family Trust. Trust holds controlling interest in Keystone. Whitfield and Crane equals lead borrower on $265 million facility Keystone led. Potential. Governance review doc, request restructure recommendation equals project delay risk. She paused on the word potential. The word marked a moral decision point. The possibility that quiet authority could be used in thoughtful ways, not vindictive ways. On the second day after the wedding, Celeste received an email from her father with no subject line and one sentence that had the clean punctuation of a person who had lived by lists. I'm sorry for the awkwardness this weekend. When you're ready, come by. There was no explanation, no triumph, only the invitation to speak. She tracked the email to a timestamp and wrote it down. 10/16, 9:03 a.m., email from Wendell, meeting, requested. She thought of the envelope again. It sat like a private presence in the pocket of the room she would later claim as memory. She imagined the letter inside late-night notes and a father's small set of ethics about how to be treated, and felt the tension between what had been withheld and what had been allowed to happen through systems beyond anyone in the room. The more she thought about governance, the more she understood how dignity could be threatened in two ways: by the small, humiliating acts at a wedding and by the cold, impersonal motions of an institution. Celeste did not yet know if her father's influence would be used too slow or too steady. She only knew that the possibility existed and that she now had an obligation first to understand, then to act. Her notebook had become an inventory of the moment. She kept the entries factual and spare. 10/16, 9:03 a.m., email from Dad. 10/16, 9:15 a.m., print, Keystone Regs. 10/16, 11:30 a.m., call Porsche Wells Keystone. Process explained. That afternoon she walked to Whitfield and Crane's offices under the pretext of dropping off thank-you notes. She watched Brennan in his element. A polished lobby, a receptionist who knew his name, framed renderings of the riverfront project promising a skyline that promised more than just buildings. He greeted her with a smile that was practiced for steadiness. He kissed her and then met her eyes in a way that made him honest for a second. She watched him measure the room, as if he were always estimating the costs and benefits of attention. He had not yet spoken to his mother about the morning's events, or if he had done so in the way of men who meant to smooth over things. Vivian's social instincts would want to convert humiliation into advantage if that is what it was. But it would also be messy, and he was unwilling to make things messy in a way that might damage the riverfront deal. For him, wardrobe and reputation mattered because they were part of the leverage you needed to close a $265 million package. For Celeste, reputation mattered because it was the soft breath in which relationships survived. In the lobby, a contractor of the firm Earl Gaines, the CFO, who usually smelled faintly of motor oil, and alertness passed Brennan a folder. Earl's eyes flicked to Celeste with the kind of quick appraisal that belonged to someone who constantly measured leverage. He nodded, and Brennan's face took on the weight of someone listening to a ledger rather than a lover. They moved toward a glassed-in meeting room. Celeste took the elevator down alone, and felt the little click of vertical transit as a tiny separation from the social performing space above, to the world where numbers had teeth. She opened her notebook and wrote, "If governance moves, process not, fury will move project." The sentence was a map and a caution. That night, Celeste dreamed of the quartet playing through a thick fog of memos. Instruments registered no suspicion of the letters being written below. She woke with the taste of coffee and the impulse to move faster than was prudent. She arranged meetings, printed annotated PDFs, and created a list of questions to ask when she next spoke with her father. She imagined what a meeting might look like in a bank conference room: a long table, nameplates that signaled neutral authority, the soft clicks of a projector. She tried to see Portia at the head of the table, calm and careful. She tried, but could not imagine the quartet in that space. The music belonged to the wedding. The bank had spreadsheet music, columns, percentages, committee votes. At dusk on the third day, she returned to the hotel where an extract of the previous Sunday existed like a memory of motion. The ballroom smelled of candles that had been blown and of the faint sweetness of desserts left behind. A florist packed peonies into a dainty box. The staff moved with a quiet that made the room the way a surgeon makes a wound quiet before stitching. Celeste stood at the edge of the floor and imagined her father at the doorway. She could hear the violins in a memory that had been recorded like a sound file. She ran her fingers along the seam of her notebook and thought about the letter again. She had seen, in her research, the mechanisms by which the Forum Trust could influence Keystone. She had seen the Whitfield loan documents and the fact that its lead lender role gave Keystone leverage. She had learned the names of the committee members and the jargon of due diligence. She had asked Portia what a documentation request looked like. She had a list of phrases. She had the map. She had not, however, yet spoken to her father about what the world might look like if governance moved. She had not opened the envelope. She had not read the letter and had no right to. Everything still fit into three imperfect categories: the personal, the procedural, and the moral. When she finally walked into the small office where Wendell wanted to meet, she found him sitting at a wooden desk that smelled faintly of lemon oil. A clock ticked on a shelf. He smiled in the way of men who keep shame and pride stitched together. He pushed a cup of tea toward her and said, simply, "Thank you for coming." He spoke in a voice that had the careful cadence of someone who had taught others to pay attention. "I'm sorry for how you were treated," he said after she described, briefly and without drama, what happened at the doorway. He did not make excuses. He did not blame. He corrected the posture of explanation toward the posture of statement. She listened, and then, because she is a person who keeps records, she wrote the time into the corner of the page. 10:17 for 12 p.m. Meeting with Dad. T. Envelope still in pocket. He offered no defense to the fact that he had been escorted. He did not ask to be defended. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and left his hand there for a moment as though feeling not the envelope, but the weight of what had been withheld and what had been necessary to withhold. Then he said a sentence that would stay with her. Some things are done quietly so others can be done loudly. It was not an instruction on how to use influence. Rather, it was an observation about the unevenness of power. He did not elaborate. That was Wendell's way. She asked him, finally, without theater, but with a kind of careful clarity, whether he was involved with Keystone. He told her, without flourish, that he was advisory chair of the Forum Family Trust. He said the words as if they were an ordinary part of life. He did not boast. He did not apologize. He only explained. The trust owned a controlling interest in Keystone. That meant the trust had the votes to influence board direction. Votes, he said, are not instructions. They are tools of stewardship. Celeste took in the description with the same professional curiosity she applied at work. She imagined committee calendars, memos, and policy language. It sounded less like a soap opera and more like a quiet machinery capable of wide movement. Wendell looked at her then, and with a clarity she had not expected, said, "I wrote you a note. I wanted to give it to you before you said your vows." She felt, suddenly, the rawness of being a daughter who had been denied a private handoff. She looked at the old man in front of her, and felt the small humiliation of that public refusal again. But she also felt the odd inversion. The man who had been pushed to the back of a rehearsal had been, in other contexts, the chair of a trust that could influence a bank. The envelope in his pocket was not a shareholder's directive. It was a private letter. That fact, she understood now in a new way, reframed everything that had happened. She did not, on that first visit, press him about whether he had spoken to anyone at Keystone. He would not be cavalier about such a thing, and because Wendell was not a man of grand gestures, she did not expect him to be. He told her only that he wanted her to read the letter in private, and that he trusted her judgment. He handed her the envelope with emotion that was more paternal than performative. She did not open it, partly because the letter felt holy to her in its way, and partly because she wanted to know more before she let private words be part of the public calculus. She slid it into her bag. Outside the window, the last light of day drew a line across the hotel's She walked back to her apartment and set the bag on the small table. She could feel the envelopes, shaped like a pebble in her pocket, persistent but not yet disrupting the surface. She opened another notebook and wrote 10/17, 6:30 p.m. Envelope in bag. Do not open. Research continues. Called Portia Monday. She fell asleep thinking of process and privacy sitting side by side. The next morning she awoke to a voicemail that began with numbers and ended with a flat phrase. This is a notice that a scheduled review will be convened. It sounded like something that belonged to a different universe, one of conference rooms and neutral nameplate. Her phone had recorded a call she did not expect to receive. She felt the sting of the voicemail like someone noting that they had looked at her ledger and found a blank entry. For a moment, the world felt smaller, the way a room feels when you realize the walls are closer than they used to be. She listened again and noted the words, scheduled review, not violent, procedural. Celeste sat at her kitchen table, and wrote the timestamp into the notebook. 10:18, 8:12 a.m. Voicemail. Scheduled review notice. She felt the hair along her arms rise, not from fear, but from the recognition that systems were entering the narrative. It was like the note of a distant bell warning the town of a storm. She made herself a list of the next small tasks. Call Portia, tell Tanisha only the bare facts, and most importantly speak with her father. She met Wendell again, at his small apartment that afternoon. He had a way of making rooms feel like they held room for silence. He did not say that he had called anyone at Keystone. He did not say that he had moved a committee. He did not claim to have done anything dramatic. He sat with her and made a pot of tea. And then he said, "I didn't ask for anything to be done for my sake." She waited for the rest. He added, simply, "But when someone treats your daughter as if she does not belong when they tidy her out of the room, that matters. You told me to write it down." "I did. That is what people like us have to do. Keep records and then use them responsibly." The sentence had the soft moral weight of someone who believed in both dignity and discretion. He meant that his private list would be a voice in a governance body if need be. He did not say he would act out of vindictiveness. He did not have to. He only had to place the fact into process. A person of influence who had been treated with influence does not always resolve what is just. Sometimes it prompts review. Celeste left the apartment with the same small white envelope still folded and pressed. She walked home through the drizzle and felt the city take on the low anonymity of people going on with their errands. She thought of the quartet and the ongoing music of processes moving through windowless rooms without violins to mark them. If the bank's scheduled review proceeded, it would do so with the measured discipline of institutional work. It would not be loud. It would be effective. When she got home, she paged through the timeline she had been building, and then, for the first time since the wedding, reached into her bag and took out the white envelope. She set it on the table like someone who sets out a relic. The envelope was the size of a single sheet folded into a private square. She did not open it. She traced its edge with a fingertip, the way someone might trace the outline of a map they intend to follow. She put the envelope down beside her notebook and wrote one last line in the evening light before she closed the book. "This could reshape things. Procedure will do the work. My job is to know what to expect." Then she closed the notebook and made a decision not yet to speak publicly. There would be a time for words, she thought, and a time for waiting. Outside, in offices and dim conference rooms, calendars were being checked. A bank's chair might not make a scene at a wedding, but the bank would register risk and call for paper. It was a different kind of removal than the one that had opened the story, the removal of a father from a doorway, but it would be no less consequential for the people under its shadow. She sat in her apartment and felt both the smallness of human embarrassment and the cold efficacy of governance sit beside one another, like two people who had never learned to hold hands. She slept with the envelope on the table next to a notebook full of timestamps and questions. Morning would bring calls and perhaps meetings. The trajectory that began at the ballroom's doorway had moved from apparel to archives, from a man's pocket to the voting percentages of a trust. The quartet would keep playing in someone's memory. The bank would keep doing its job in its conference rooms. Whether the two would collide in ruin or in a careful correction had not yet been written. Celeste awoke restless and went to the notebook to add a new entry, 10:19, 7:04 a.m. phone. Portia returned call. "We are reviewing," she said. The line was measured. The word review again, dry and procedural. Celeste thought of the door closing and imagined the slow gears that turned in windowless rooms. She understood, with a new clarity, that a private slight could travel by very ordinary means into extraordinary consequence. She did not, then, know which way it would turn. She only knew enough to keep writing. 10:19 partes las 11:22 alto M. Keystone, Credit Committee convened. Not spending. The notice Celeste had half expected arrived in the form of calm efficiency. An email with an agenda, a list of participants, and an attachment labeled Credit Committee, Whitfield and Crane, request for documentation. In the subject line, a time-stamped meeting followed, 4 days after the wedding. Celeste circled the date in her notebook and, because habit made her literal, wrote the names she had found before Portiche wears a senior credit analyst, members of Keystone's credit committee, legal counsel on retainer. She did not need to imagine the room anymore. Process had written it for her. Brennan learned of the meeting when Earl, the CFO, who kept his confidence in small, practical gestures, stepped into his office and closed the door with the handful of privacy that corporate walls could grant. Earl had the kind of face refined by Legisquick in judgment, slower in spectacle. He handed Brennan the committee email. "They're calling a review," he said. "They're asking for updated cash flow models, updated pre-leasing numbers, and 3 months of operating statements. They want to see contingency plans." Brennan scanned the document with the same speed he scanned drawings, looking for structural weaknesses. He felt an immediate, practical irritation rather than fear. A delay could be managed. Delays cost money, but also required choices. He paced the glassed-in conference room, watched cranes in renderings that promised a skyline, and told Earl to get the modeling team moving. He did not, at first, understand the vector by which a small social gesture would bend into institutional review. For him, the act at the doorway was a social misstep, bad manners, perhaps, but not the beginning of a corporate motion. At Keystone, Portia rehearsed her points the way an analyst rehearses a call to market, measured, precise, rehearsed for objectivity. The committee's agenda used neutral language. It called for clarifying documentation and risk sensitivity analysis, and reserve recommendation to restructure as a contingency. The words were not dramatic on their own. They were instruments that, when set in motion, altered time. When Brennan arrived at Keystone 4 days later, the waiting room was spare, and the lighting level low enough to avoid glare on tablets and printed books. He had arranged the meeting to be direct. He wanted facts. The numbers he understood. The committee's chair introduced herself. Portia sat near a projector. A stack of files fanned out like unimpeachable cards. The nameplate at the far end of the table said simply, "Advisory Chair, Forum Family Trust." Brennan felt a sudden, small vertigo at the sight of Wendell's title in black type on a corporate placard. It was the kind of literalness that could reframe a room. A man he had worried about at the doorway was, in another context, a point of leverage. For a moment, social performance and governance overlapped in ways he had not permitted himself to consider. He did not leave the room. He kept his composure. That was the skill he prized, and the one he believed in. Portia began with the facts. She explained, in plain language, what any lead lender would do when risk indicator suggested a need for reassessment. "We convene," she said. "We ask for updated models to test sensitivities. We document if volatility appears in our stress tests. We make recommendations, either enhanced reporting, additional covenants, or, in material cases, restructuring." She put each technical term into a short definition, restructuring as a change in loan terms or oversight intended to reduce lender exposure. Additional documentation requested as a hold designed to let the bank measure risk more precisely. The language was dry. Its consequences were not. The committee had not yet reached a conclusion. The chair, who had been quiet up to that point, turned the attention to Brennan with the kind of professional neutrality that insists on fact over feeling. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "we're not here to punish. We're here to determine whether existing protections are sufficient given present circumstances." Brennan's instinct was to argue on principle. He found, however, that the room refused grandstanding. It returned him to spreadsheets and projected models. Requests were specific: updated escrow schedules, confirmations of pre-lease commitments, an independent third-party appraisal, and a revised list of guarantors. Each request, in isolation, was normal. In sequence, they created a pipeline that would slow disbursements until the bank felt comfortable with its exposure. It was not revenge. It was governance. Back at Whitfield and Crane, the project calendar shivered. Contractors who had been ready to mobilize held off on final scheduling calls. Subcontractors delayed ordering long lead materials. The Crane Company sent a tentative rescheduling list. A structural engineer sent an email marked pending confirmation. Investors who had been soft-nodding to promotional slides began to ask direct questions. The effect was immediate in its quietness. Deadlines slipped. Bids expired. The mood shifted from assured upward momentum to strategic caution. The story of a man removed from a doorway had been translated into documents and calendars, and the kind of prudence that builds into cost over. Celeste watched the cascade from the periphery and catalogued it like a professional taking minutes. 10:20 seconds, 9:04 a.m. Brennan, at Keystone. 10:20 seconds, 11:30 a.m. Whitfield and Crane receiving dock requests. 10:20 seconds, 2:16 p.m. Contractor hold notices. She kept the entries brief and factual. Emotion was a dangerous variable in a ledger. The bank's recommendation, voiced a week later in a memo titled Recommendation to Restructure Facility, was methodical. It suggested adding oversight measures, monthly financial reporting, an independent monitor for covenant compliance, and the appointment of an additional non-executive director aligned with lender interests. All of this would remain within the framework of the loan. None of it removed underlying ownership. In plain terms, Brennan would keep his equity stake, but the bank would insert checks that curtailed unilateral control over certain project decisions. The change aimed to protect the lender's exposure without confiscating ownership. At dinner that evening, Vivian paced the family room in a way that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with social repair. She had watched the morning's news. Her network of acquaintances had steeped in speculation, and she had one instinctive fear that humiliation might become headline. She phoned Brennan once, twice, then Earl. They talked in terms of risk and control. Vivian's tone was less about whether Wendell had been rude, and more about who could be blamed and who could be. It was, in its way, an exercise in social triage. Brennan, pressed against the wall of a new and unwanted reality, made decisions. He did not storm into meetings to shout. He organized briefings. He tasked Earl with preparing the requested documentation and with finding a mediator who could speak credibly to the bank about operational material. He also arranged to see Whitney. The visit to Wendell's apartment took place 3 evenings after the committee meeting. Brennan went prepared to ask blunt questions. Did Wendell call Keystone? Had he mentioned the wedding? Was this action a result of pride or principle? The answers he wanted were simple. The answers he received were not. Wendell met him without ostentation. The room smelled of lemon oil and old books. A kettle sat on a stove. Brennan stood for a few moments, measuring the fold of Wendell's cardigan, and in a private, almost involuntary waha, the man's hands had once steadied a child's scraped knee. The private domestic scene folded into the public drama with an ache that was unexpected. "I came because I wanted you to have this," Wendell said, and he reached into his jacket. He did not dramatize the moment. He handed over the small white envelope. Brennan took it with a flinch that felt both defensive and obliged. Brennan had seen power in many forms: press conferences, zoning hearings, shareholder calls. This was power in the opposite register, the quiet of an untelevised moment. He did not open the letter. He had the impulse to do so, to subject private lines to the corrective light of curiosity. But Wendell's eyes carried a request that was less an order than a simple, old-fashioned insistence on courtesy. "Read it to her," Wendell said. "It's for Celeste." Brennan's mouth set. The demand was reasonable and impossible. He was not used to being entrusted with what he felt might be sacred. The instruction landed on him like a small moral test. Deliver the letter without commentary, without unfolding its contents into argument. He promised, in a way that felt like a contract without signatures. After Brennan left Wendell's apartment, he sat in his car for a long time and let the letter rest on the passenger seat like a thing with weight. He imagined the ways the letter could be used, weaponized, hidden, invoked, and then realized that Wendell's insistence on privacy had the power to disarm that impulse. He kept the envelope folded and drove home with no one to show and nothing to say. Celeste, in the meantime, continued her work of mapping. She met with Portia again in a neutral cafe outside the bank. Portia kept the meeting procedural. Her language was risk indicators and trigger events, but she also allowed a human syllable to slip through. "We do this by the book," she said. We check boxers. Sometimes people feel they're being targeted. Sometimes a shareholder wants clarity. Those things can converge. I can't know motives. I know. Process. Celeste recorded it as a line in the notebook. 10/25 to 11 p.m. Portia, we do this by the book. She underlined process twice. When the package of requested documents arrived at Key, formatted, comprehensive Portia's team ran them through sensitivity models. The numbers bent in ways that required attention. The bank did not place an outright freeze. It placed calibrated constraints. The loan stayed on the books, but with new conditions. Reporting cadence was shortened. An independent monitor was recommended, and certain disbursements were conditional on achieving specified milestones. The memo concluded with a phrase that mattered more than any headline might. Recommendation accepted by credit committee with oversight measures. That sentence was a technical one. Its human consequence would be experienced in boardrooms, construction sites, and the private spaces between. For Brennan it felt like a loss and a necessary correction. He retained his stake, but his unilateral authority to direct certain decisions was circumscribed. He could continue to shepherd the project forward, but he would need to do so within a structure that gave the bank and by extension the trust greater oversight. It was not the end of his career. It was an alteration in how it would be exercised. He resented the loss and recognized its logic in the same breath. The first call Brennan made after the committee's memo went out was to Celeste. They spoke on a line that carried the acoustic intimacy of two people trying to measure a relationship against an institutional change. He explained the bank's recommendations without venom and without theatricality. She listened. The words retained equity, and additional oversight did not sound like the end of anything as much as a recalibration. I didn't expect this, he said finally. I didn't think. I know, she answered. Her voice was flat with exhausted clarity rather than anger. She had watched the machine work. She had catalogued its motions. It's what I thought might happen, she added. Procedure does its work. The line between public consequence and private pain thinned in that call. Brennan's pride had been bruised. Celeste's grief at the doorway's denial had not been erased. But in place of theatrics they found a quieter thing. A willingness to talk facts, to assemble a plan. They did not promise swift healing. They promised to be careful. The letter waited on Celeste's nightstand for 3 days. She kept it folded in the same way Wendell had folded it. On the 4th day, she opened it with the slow reverence of someone breaking a seal between two people. The handwriting was small and deliberate. She did not record its lines verbatim in her notebook, but she copied the tone. Soft, instructive, anchored in dignity. The letter asked her to remember what mattered to value, small, steady kindness. To recognize how people show care even when their gestures are awkward, and to insist on being treated with respect. It included a request, if she ever felt disregarded, to speak plainly. And if someone close to her erred, to test their motives before assuming malice. Reading the letter, Celeste felt the thin membrane between father and institution dissolve into a human plea. Wendell's voice in the margins of the paper had nothing to do with votes or procedures. It had to do with a father asking his daughter to be seen fully. The envelope had not been a corporate tool. It had been a human act that had been prevented and then quietly returned. Celeste wrote a single line in the margin after finishing the letter. 10/29, 9:18 p.m. Letter read. Tone, dignity. Asked for measured grace. Her pen hesitated. Then she called Brennan and, as instructed by the letter's plain force, read a short passage aloud. The effect was immediate. The conversation shifted from grievance to what Wendell had asked: recognition, not triumph. In the days that followed, the parties adjusted. Keystone's oversight measures settled into place. The independent monitor attended monthly calls. An additional non-executive director was appointed to the project's steering committee with the bank's assent. These changes had practical effects. Decisions requiring immediate, unilateral action now needed a collaborative nod. Budget reallocations had to be documented. Certain high-impact procurement choices paused until compliance sign-offs were obtained. The project did not die. It took on the rhythm of careful bureaucracy. At Whitfield and Crane, Brennan learned the pragmatics of constrained authority. He adapted by leaning into relationship building. Investors were briefed more frequently. Contractors got clearer timelines, and he created a public-facing timeline to reassure stakeholders. By the end of the quarter, the project had reorganized around new practices. It cost more time and attention. It also forced more robust risk management. In several meetings, investors admitted that the bank's additional oversight had paradoxically reduced their anxiety. Celeste continued to keep records. Her notebook spine wore a new line of impressions. She used it less as evidence to be wielded and more as a ledger of lived choices. She wrote small domestic entries. 11:05, 6:22 p.m., family dinner. Wendell quiet. BBM Poraito. Brennan candid. The entries became maps of emotional terrain as much as corporate terrain. The confrontation she had anticipated, one where accusatory words would be thrown and reputations diced, never quite happened. When Brennan finally faced Vivian in a living room that smelled of camellia tea and old perfume, the scene was less a boxing ring than a negotiation table. Vivian framed things socially, Brennan framed things operationally, and Celeste framed them personally. They spoke with reserve. Words meant to wound were mostly withheld. The letter's presence as a private act complicated performative anger. It demanded an honesty that was small and stubborn. Wendell returned to his routines with the same quietness that had defined him before any of this began. He continued to write lists and to keep his appointments. He cut the same path between his front door and the bench at the small park where neighborhood dogs favored his presence. He did not use his influence for spectacle. He did not call press conferences. He answered phone calls a little less often but with the same measured cadence. When Celeste stopped by his apartment on a Sunday with a pie from the market, he smiled and accepted the offering with no grand paternal pronouncements. He had not sought to punish. He had sought, in the way he knew, to ensure his daughter's dignity would be recognized. Months later, as scaffolding rose and permits were filed, as accountants closed another quarter with adjusted covenants, and as the quartet's memory dimmed into social footnote, Celeste sat in a cafe and compared to sentences she had written at different times. 10:14, 10:52 a.m., envelope returned to pocket, quartet continues, and, months later, 02:03, 3:40 p.m., project continues under restructured oversight. Brennan retains equity. New governance practiced. Both sentences contained truth. The first held the immediate human wound. The second held the long, procedural answer. Quiet power and public performance had met and produced a third thing. A rearrangement that emphasized stewardship over spectacle. The bank had done its job in its clinical way. The father's letter had done its work in its human way. Neither erased the other. The moral of the story was not a satisfying plot.